Let's see, let's make sure everybody can see that. Um, as you heard, I'm going to try and give you a kind of background to the exhibition in Hackney, covering about 2,000 years, something like that. I should just make it clear that um, those I'm including are all either people who migrated directly to the African continent, or I think their parents or a parent at least came to Britain from the African continent. I should also explain that I'm using some images to illustrate the what I'm going to say. Images are not always illustrative of everything, of every aspect of history, but I'm going to try and anyway touch on some key themes or key issues within that 2,000 years. I can't cover everything and everyone, so please don't be upset if somebody is excluded. It's just to give a kind of overview of different facets of this history, and we've called it a hidden history. It's obviously not entirely hidden, but perhaps not as well known as perhaps it should be. So I'm going to start off in Roman times, and I guess the first thing to say about the history of Africans in Britain is that it stretches back probably 1,000 years before Roman times, at least. That we don't have anyway all the evidence from that period, or even all the evidence from Roman times. But what we do have is some quite interesting evidence of Africans being here, young people, women, probably families as well. And this is an example. Obviously, this is a reconstruction of one of the most famous of those African Romans, known as the Ivory Bangle lady, whose remains were discovered in York, and she was around in the 3rd century of our era, thereabouts. She was, I guess, a contemporary of the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus, who was himself of African origin, a Libyan in origin. But these are just two of those Romans. There was also a Roman governor who was from North Africa, Algeria, and so on. So the archaeological evidence is limited only in the sense that more work needs to be done. And I'm pretty sure that as more work is done, there will be many more finds. And I haven't got time to go into all the existing evidence, but you can just take my word for it that there are numerous examples. I guess the importance of Ivory Bangle lady is not only that she was young and that we have some kind of reconstruction of what she may have looked like, but that she was buried with ivory bangles amongst other jewelry, therefore indicating her status. And in the past, people have looked at Africans in ancient Britain, in Roman Britain, in Britain before the Norman conquest as, okay, well, there may have been some Africans, but they were probably enslaved, and this kind of approach. And she is just one illustration that this was very far from being the case. As I say, Septimus Severus would be another example. There are similar finds throughout the succeeding period, but I thought it's just worth mentioning one other figure from this early period, and that is Hadrian. And Hadrian was another North African, probably from Libya, sent by the Pope to, and originally was asked to become Archbishop of Canterbury, but refused, but was sent as an aide to the Archbishop again around 700 of our era, and was important in the sense that he went to Canterbury, is noted for reforming the church, particularly in terms of its educational system. And he's referred to in Bede's Ecclesiastical History, and this is what the image is showing you, an image of Bede's Ecclesiastical History of that period. And again, he refers to Hadrian as a man, a person of African race, or at least that is the translation that has been given. And there's no doubt that Hadrian, amongst his educational and religious reforms, introduced books and learning from his homeland and from North Africa in general. So these are, we could say, relatively famous individuals. There are others. There are, again, archaeological remains of other Africans who were around in Britain during this period. This is the period before the Norman conquest. And again, future research will no doubt bring out more examples. The latest kind of DNA techniques which are used to both to date the remains of human beings and also to link them to particular origins through various scientific processes are very expensive, and so they're not necessarily always used in the way that they might be. But undoubtedly, more examples will be found. The kind of latest research has looked at the period of the 14th century, the time of the Black Death in England and around Europe, and again is finding more and more examples of Africans from that period, so 14th century, 13th century, and these exactly where they came from, why they were here. At the moment, we don't have all the answers to. So moving on with my pictorial survey, I guess a famous picture is that of the trumpeter known as John Blank, who was around in the early 16th century. And this picture dates from about 1511, something like that, and was a royal trumpeter. And again, as is now much more well known, there were significant numbers, certainly hundreds of Africans in the British Isles in that period. That's both in England and in Scotland. Some of them connected with the royal courts, both the Court of England and the Court of Scotland. Some of them came directly from Africa, from different parts of Africa, certainly from North Africa, from West Africa, from South Africa. Some came as a result of Britain's new maritime links with West Africa. This is the period when human trafficking was developing. But there were also people here who came to study, who were occupied in various professions. Perhaps the most famous, I suppose, one of those would be Jacques Francis, who was a diver. But there are many others. Some others, that we could say of African heritage, would have come from Europe through Spain and probably from Portugal as well during this period. But there were certainly people who came directly from Africa. And again, as I mentioned, from different parts of the continent, including the important relations which the Tudor court had with Morocco and with the Kingdom of Morocco. So again, it's a presence that was not unusual in Tudor and Stuart times. Okay, I'm going to move on, just because of time, to the 18th century. And I said, talking about the last slide, that this was a period when England's relationship with Africa was transformed. And of course, one could go into this in great detail, but it became an increasingly exploitative relationship. And this famous portrait of William Ansah illustrates that exploitative relationship. And William Ansah was the son of a human trafficker from what is today Ghana, who was sent to England to be educated, as was the tradition in the 18th century and even long before in the 16th century. Unfortunately, the person he was entrusted to was unscrupulous and kidnapped him. He was enslaved and taken to Barbados, much to the upset of his father, who wasn't used to his own sons being kidnapped and trafficked in that manner. The father issued an ultimatum to those in Britain concerned with human trafficking, namely the government and the Royal Africa Company, and they immediately sent their envoys to Barbados to release William Ansell, who was brought to London, given a suit of clothes, taken to the theatre, taken to the opera, etc., had his short biography written about him, and then was returned to his father, none the worse for his experiences. And human trafficking between that part of West Africa and the Royal Africa Company continued. And there are some other examples, but William Ansell illustrates one of the connections which brought Africans to Britain during this period. Of course, at that time, there were many others who came by force, and this is an illustration of one of them. And it's just useful to remember that in the 18th century, slavery was a feature of British life. African children, boys and girls, were treated as pets, to be put in collars, to be given pet names, and to be presented in this manner, and to be sold. And here you can see an example of such a sale, if you like. This is from a Liverpool newspaper of that period, and anyway, it doesn't need to be dwelt on in any great detail. It speaks for itself. But as well as these sales, happened to my slides, that's better. We also have examples of those who ran away, and I'm just using this as this particular slide as an example. There are many examples, and I don't actually know where this particular woman originated in the immediate sense, but it's an illustration of the efforts of those who were enslaved during that period to liberate themselves from their bondage within England. Well, of course, during the 18th century, amongst those Africans who were here were various celebrities. As I've just indicated, many were held in very difficult circumstances, but there were others who were relatively favoured, and one of those was Phillis Wheatley, who was born in what is today Senegal, or that region of West Africa, and was trafficked to what was then the English colony of Boston in North America, but showed a prodigious talent as a poet, and so was brought to Britain around the 1770s, early 1770s, where her talent was displayed for all to see, and her poems on various subjects were published. She only remained in the country for a short period before she returned to Boston. But again, she's just another example of the kind of diversity of African subjects that we can find during that period. The most famous of these is or was Olaudah Equiano, who is well known, I think, probably to everybody, and was amongst those who were most active politically during that period, both as a member of the Sons of Africa organization, which he formed along with about a dozen others, probably as a representative body representing other Africans who were here and which campaigned against human trafficking, enslavement, and so on. He was also obviously a best-selling writer who published his autobiography in the late 18th century. And he, amongst other things, was also a member of the London Corresponding Society. And London Corresponding Society was a radical, yes, we could say, yes, revolutionary organization of that period. Its politics can be gauged from this quote from its founder, Thomas Hardy, and it's quite an important quote, although it relates to politics more generally. It's interesting to reflect that this was the organization, therefore the politics that Equiano presumably subscribed to. In other words, the indivisibility of rights. If you fight for the rights of one section of the people, then you should fight for the rights of all. And anyway, that's quite an important political principle. And Equiano, who's here referred to by his slave name, Gustavus Vassa, lived with Thomas Hardy and his wife for some time, 1870s, during the period when he was writing his autobiography. Okay, so other examples. Oh. And this is a image of a trumpeter from, it's actually 18th century period, from the late 18th century period, but I want to use it just to refer not just to the late 18th century, but 19th century as well, because many of those Africans who were here and who settled here were connected with the armed forces, both the Army and the Navy, Royal Navy as well as the Merchant Navy. We don't have images of all of them, but they settled here. They often had English, Scottish, Irish partners, wives, not always, but there tended to be an imbalance between African men and African women during this period. And in fact, right up until probably the 1940s, that was the case. So you would often find African men cohabiting or being connected with local women. This is an interesting picture in that this trumpeter is a member of one of the household regiments, which is unusual if you look at the army today. It's rare to find Africans in those particular regiments. Okay, so I'm moving on to the 19th century. Again, there are many examples that one could give of those Africans who lived here, both men and women. Most were impoverished. Again, a variety of occupations. In the 19th century, we begin to get the growth of kind of distinct communities of those from Africa, as well as those from the Caribbean and from the US, as well as other parts of the world, especially in port cities like London, Liverpool, Bristol, Glasgow, Manchester to some extent. So these communities were, let's say, developing from the 19th century. In addition, we have, again, various celebrities who were, we can say, or celebrated figures, and none perhaps more noteworthy than this young woman, Sarah Forbes Bonetta, who was renamed originally Aina. She was a Yoruba woman who had been kidnapped in Africa Anne was freed by an Englishman and brought to Britain. It essentially was given as a gift to Queen Victoria, we could say, and so was kind of adopted as a goddaughter, as Queen Victoria, was educated at the Queen's expense, spent some time with her, and remained close to the royal family until her marriage later on in the 19th century. Was married in Britain as well. So she's very atypical of African women during that period, but an interesting figure nonetheless. She wasn't the only African adopted by Victoria. I guess the other would be Prince Alemayehu, who was captured, kidnapped from Ethiopia, was the son of Emperor Tewodros of Ethiopia, and was kidnapped and essentially held in Britain until his early death. And there's still squabbles over his remains, which I think are still within the confines of Windsor Castle. So anyway, these again are not typical figures, but certainly illustrates the diversity of those who were here during that period. Another well-known figure is Samuel Coleridge Taylor, the composer who was born in Croydon in 1875 and whose father had come as a student from West Africa, from Sierra Leone. Coleridge Taylor became a noted musician and composer, as well as a political activist, particularly involved in the 1900 Pan-African Conference. His work is still available around, and sometimes various concerts are given of his work. He's, I suppose, most famous for his choral pieces, but he was intent on, or claimed that he intended to kind of use, I suppose, what he would have called Negro melodies as the basis of classical music, and those still exist, written for piano and also for other instruments, and people can listen to them, based on spirituals, African American spirituals, much of that work. He was, as I say, a significant figure, but died at the early age of 37. This is another probably significant figure from the 19th century, another Sierra Leonean who came here as a student, as many West Africans started to do in that period, or started to do in larger numbers during that period. So people tended to come, men in particular tended to come as workers, particularly as seafarers, or as students of one sort or another. And as colonialism developed in Africa, more people were drawn to Britain to study for various roles and to study in institutions that weren't available in the colonies. And James Horton, Africanus Horton, was sent to study medicine. He became a doctor, a surgeon, and as you can see, was a member of the British Armed Forces. But he was more than just an army surgeon. That's quite important because he was an officer in the British Army. But he also took an interest in West African affairs, particularly political affairs in West Africa, as well as taking a stand against the racism of the day. And he wrote in particular to refute anti-African racism, which was so prevalent in the 19th century. He also undertook various medical investigations, including investigations into sickle cell anemia. He was one of the first to kind of record the nature of, I think, the symptoms of sickle cell and so on. So anyway, one could say much more about him, but that perhaps will do by way of introduction. Now, this picture is by somebody, or of somebody, who again is a 19th century figure, but it's not certain exactly who this woman was. But I'm using this as an image, as if you like, as a symbol of all those who were unknown or as yet unknown, and in particular also for somebody who's known but who we have no photos of, or at least yet, although I think photos do exist, and that's Alice Kinloch. And Alice Kinloch is the woman who, I guess we could say, founded the modern Pan-African movement. She only came to Britain briefly in the 1890s, and she came to protest and to lecture about the conditions facing her compatriots in South Africa. But she inspired Henry Sylvester Williams and others to create the African Association, which then went on to convene the first Pan-African Conference in London in 1900. So, as I said, we can credit her with inspiring the beginnings of the modern Pan-African movement. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the 20th century, and as I said, one of the significant categories of Africans around were students, and this young man is one of my favorites. His name was Bandeli Omoniyi. He was a student mainly in Edinburgh, but he gave up his studies. He came from also quite a humble background, which was not normally the case with students from West Africa. And in these times, it was mainly students from what became Britain's colonies in West Africa that were more likely to come to this country and to be, sometimes if they were wealthy enough, to be schooled here as well as to attend higher education. But Bandeli Omoniyi gave up his medical studies to devote himself to politics. He wrote in the paper of the Independent Labour Party. He penned letters to MPs and to complaining about various aspects of colonial rule. And then he left Britain still at an early age and went to Brazil, where he became engaged in politics and died at the young age of 27 after being imprisoned. But he again is representative of a whole generation of what we can call student politicians, young people who came here often with the aim of qualifying for something in particular, and because of the conditions they found here and because of their growing awareness of what was going on in the world, the nature of colonial rule, racism, and so on, they became increasingly involved in political activity. Okay, so I've skipped over First World War because we can assume everybody knows that Africans participated in the First World War, including those who were based here. And I moved on to 1919. And in 1919, there were attacks on, racist attacks on Africans, those from the Caribbean, and others, other people of color, as people might say today, Yemenis, and others who were very often based in such port cities as Cardiff. These attacks occurred in Glasgow, in Cardiff, in London, in Liverpool, in Barry, in about 9 towns and cities throughout Britain. They're connected with the particular position that coloured seamen, if I can use that expression, occupied, which was that they were often portrayed as undermining the wage levels of English or white workers, which wasn't necessarily the case, but they were often treated in that way by the government as well as by trade union leaders and so on. And so a racist division, we can say, was created between these two groups of workers, which sometimes broke out into, they're called riots, but racist attacks, as I say, which broke out. And the difficulties facing these coloured seamen, as they were called at the time, continued throughout the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s in various forms. And indeed, the government even introduced openly racist legislation to attack them, such as the Coloured Alien Seamen's Order, which was enacted in 1925. So in these attacks, of course, those Africans and their families fought back. And we have several accounts of what actually took place. This is one by Ibrahim Ismail, who was a Somali who was based in Cardiff at that time, who gave this account of what occurred. And you can see that they were very violent attacks. Another person who wrote about the attacks that took place is Ernest Mark, whose book or autobiography, Old Man Trouble, details the attacks in Liverpool, as well as detailing the life of a person who was a stowaway, a seaman, a club owner, a boxer, and all sorts of other things in between. So again, there were a variety of Africans here, predominantly men, although some women, and engaged in a variety of different occupations, many of them just about organizing to survive. Okay, so when we go into the 1920s, we find various efforts to organize amongst Africans during that period. And this is one of the, not earliest, but one of the earliest which established a kind of sizable organization dating from 1924. This is the Nigerian Progress Union, which was formed in London at that time by the gentleman you can see seated on the bottom right of that picture. But it was jointly formed with the woman sitting in the middle, who wasn't a Nigerian at all, but was Amy Ashwood Garvey, the first wife of Marcus Garvey. And they met in London. She was living in Streatham at that time. And I think there were hints of a romance. But anyway, they organized the Nigerian Progress Union as a way of organizing Nigerians, particularly in London, and of discussing the future of Nigeria, what needed to be done. Obviously, this is the high point of colonialism, what needed to be done to move Nigeria forward. The following year, Ladipo Solanke, who organized the Nigerian Progress Union, established, along with others, the West African Students' Union, which became the main African organization in Britain, we can say, for the next 30 years. And here we see the West African Students' Union pictured in their first hostel in Camden. This is the Camden Road Hostel. And you can see in the middle of the photo Paul Robeson and Eslanda Robeson, who were the patrons, or Paul Robeson was one of the patrons of the West African Students' Union and regularly visited them and was connected with them for many, many years. And if you read I'm not going to explain who Paul Robeson was, but if you read uh, his testimony, his memoir, as it were, he says that he discovered Africa in London, and one of the reasons for that is his connection with West African Students' Union, or WASU as it was known. Well, this is a rather interesting poster advertising both the hostel as well as the journal which WASU produced. And it tells us various things. One is that you can see that it's available in clearly in London, but it's also available in West Africa. And in the course of establishing the organization in London, it also established branches throughout West Africa. But it also had its agents and supporters in the Caribbean, in America, in various other places. There it says India, Japan, China, Germany, etc., etc. So anyway, it's a kind of fascinating poster which I came across many years ago in the US. I don't know what it was doing in the US, but anyway, it gives you just an example of how organized these guys were in the 1920s and 1930s. And here we see a later picture of West African Students' Union. This is probably 1940s, and it's from the second hostel, the South Villas hostel. And of course, during this intervening period, more and more Africans were coming to study, men and women, as you can see from this picture, as well as children, of course. And this hostel is also in the Camden area. It was largely organized by this woman, whose name is or was Olu Obisanya, later Ogunbiyi, who was the wife of Ladipo Shoyinka. And this picture is actually taken from an interview I did with her a few years ago. I think she was 95 or 96 when I interviewed her this time. And she came to Britain in 1932 and remembered very vividly. I think you'll see her in the exhibition at Hackney Museum. But she was the main organizer, and one of the things that she talks about is providing food, Nigerian food, and what they did to make sure they had the right ingredients, and how she trained people. And I remember her saying that she trained an Irish woman to cook whatever it was, jollof rice, or I can't remember now. The importance of the hostel was, of course, that in Britain in this period, racism was legal. There were no laws against racism. What was called the colour bar was ubiquitous. It was very difficult for Africans to find accommodation. If they did find accommodation, it was often more expensive. So West African Students' Union decided to develop their own hostel. Of course, these students also included people like the famous nurse Ademola, who came to study initially in the 1930s along with her sister, and has gone down as being particularly famous because a film was made about her during the Second World War, a propaganda film, which unfortunately has disappeared. We only have the stills. But there were many African women who came during this period, late 1930s, 1940s, and even before in the 1920s, to study nursing or to study medicine, some as doctors. Another of the notable ones was Princess Sahai from Ethiopia, the daughter of Haile Selassie, who came into exile in the mid-1930s and also trained for a time in Britain. And there are numerous others, like Irene Cole, Irene Igodaro, who later became one of the founders of the West African Women's Association in 1948, one of the first African women's organizations to be established. And a lot of this history of African women as nurses has been recovered or rediscovered by Young Historians Projects. If you want to know more about that, then you should go to their website, and there's all kinds of information there. But again, it's a kind of hidden history that, of course, yes, there were people from the Caribbean who were nurses, but, well, yes, there were women from Africa who were nurses, doctors, and engaged in other medical professions. So they should be acknowledged, remembered. Shouldn't be a secret for anybody. Okay, so moving on to the 1940s. Well, of course, we have the famous Manchester Pan-African Congress, but I decided to use this photo, which is a photo taken around the same time of West Africans who were engaged in the Congress and in the organizations which flowed from it, such as the West African National Secretariat. And two of the most prominent ones we can see in the front row. On the extreme right here, we have Kwame Nkrumah, who was certainly involved in the organization of the Manchester Pan-African Congress. And second from the left, Isaac Wallace Johnson, who was also one of the key political figures at that time, originally from Sierra Leone, but active within Britain during the 1930s and 1940s. And Nkrumah, in particular, was around in Britain for certainly a couple of years after this, and as I say, was involved in West African National Secretariat and other important organizations set up by those from the four British colonies in West Africa: Nigeria, the Gold Coast, Sierra Leone, and Gambia. And again, in this period, probably the majority of Africans who were here, probably from West Africa, although there were also significant numbers of those from Somalia, I would say, who were in the main seafarers, although there were some who were not and were engaged in other work and professions. Okay, well, very quickly, this is just illustration of the kind of political organizing which people did. This is to support the general strike in Nigeria in 1945. Well, again, I've missed out the Second World War just because of time. To mention, this is a well-known picture, but the gentleman, as you can see, second from the left, is a RAF navigator called Johnny Smythe. He was originally from Sierra Leone. He served during the war, was shot down, was a prisoner of war in Germany, and then returned to Britain, where he had a connection with a certain boat, which I'm usually very reluctant to mention, but he was employed by the Colonial Office to repatriate service personnel, and one of the boats used to repatriate service personnel to the Caribbean after the war was a ship called the SS Windrush. So he sailed for the Caribbean on that vessel and then returned with those who had been picked up in the Caribbean or wanted to return to Britain, and he was engaged in advising them, shall we say, of the difficulties of living in Britain during that period, and in some ways, anyway, kind of giving them a briefing before they landed at Tilbury. Okay. Well, then I guess we could look at 1940s, 1950s. I'm conscious about time. And as I said before, many of those men who came alone, not all, but many, and found local women as their partners and wives. And these relationships were very important in many towns and cities, and they've been studied in some places. This comes from the Afro Solo project, which was based in Manchester and which looks at the lives of the men and their wives and the children. So if you're interested in that history, then Google Afro Solo and you'll see all the work that Sue Andy and others have done in that area. And talking of Manchester, one of the key figures, I suppose, in Manchester's history in the early 20th century was Len Johnson, who was the son of a man from Sierra Leone. Len Johnson is well known for his participation, I suppose, in the Manchester Congress, but particularly as a boxer, and a very successful boxer, but a boxer barred by or prevented from developing his career as a consequence of the colour bar, because the colour bar also existed in boxing. And if you were a person not of pure European descent, as was the expression, then you could not compete for a British title. So he was prevented from doing that. Later, a very prominent anti-racist campaigner in Manchester, where he established the New Internationalist Society, and also a friend of Paul Robeson, amongst others. This is Kathleen Rasama, who was an Ethiopian woman who was transported to Britain as a child in rather dubious circumstances by, the story goes, by missionaries, and then it seems left to fend for herself. For a time she was in a children's home in Yorkshire, was an actress, undertook various occupations before settling in London with her husband, who was a Somali man named Suleiman, and they established a boarding house for Somali sailors in the 1940s, at a time when there were increasing numbers of Africans coming to London as well as to other cities, and people found it very difficult. Seafarers as well as others found it very difficult to find places to live. She later established the Stepney Coloured People's Association and campaigned for the rights of people in that part of East London. Okay, well, these again, different types of people. Desmond Buckle was a communist, lived in Britain from a very young age. He went to school in Britain and then stayed and became one of the leading communists with particular concerns with Africa. He was a journalist by training. Here we see him speaking at a congress. Anyway, an important figure. I haven't got time to say more about him. Paul Stevenson, another famous African, best known for his involvement in the Bristol bus boycott and associated anti-racist campaigns in the 1960s. Again, I'm conscious of time. I mean, there are so many examples one can give of individuals and so on, but sometimes organizations are more important. And this is one of those organizations, the Committee of African Organizations, that was formed in the end of the 1950s, 1958, 59. It became it kind of superseded WASU as the main organization, main African organization in Britain. It was a coalition of about 14 different organizations from all over the African continent. And it produced this paper, the United Africa. It also established All African Students' Union in Europe. It had its own Africa Unity House, which was provided by Kwame Nkrumah. And it's a very important organization, which again, I haven't got time to go into now. One of the things which it did was to establish we can say, what became the anti-apartheid movement in Britain. As you can see, that became, as you know, a very prominent organization, but it was first established by Africans in the 1959, I think, initially. And one of those connected with the Committee of African Organizations in fact, the editor for a time of its publication was Obiang, who you can see pictured here, who then became one of the leading lights of what's come to be called the Black Power movement in Britain, and the leader of Universal Coloured People's Association for some years, imprisoned and engaged in all kinds of things, and who wrote a book about the politics of that time. Anyway, he came out of that Pan-African politics of the Committee of African Organizations. Well, there are so many other people one could mention. I suppose in particular, we're now finding a greater interest in those women activists. And here, pictured in the middle of this picture, is Kath Locke, with her, who along with her two sisters was a key, they were like a key force within Manchester politics, both within organizations like Universal Coloured People's Association and Black Unity and Freedom Party, and later with Abasindi, which was an organization established for women of African and Caribbean heritage. And I'm pleased to see that more note and more work is taking of them and others like them during this period. And of course, their families and the history of their father is also particularly interesting, and the kinds of things that he did and the experiences that they had as a family, extremely important. There are others, of course, like Martha Ossamore, who is now Baroness, I understand, but was a key activist during the 1980s, particularly connected with Broadwater Farm Youth Association, and so on. So there are many examples of those who played a prominent role over the centuries. Well, I thought I would close with this gentleman, David Oluwole, who was essentially killed by the police in Leeds in 1969. But he's representative of, in some ways, of those who came from Africa during the 1940s, when people tend to think of maybe of increased migration from other parts of the world, but there was increased migration from Africa, particularly from West Africa, but other parts of the continent as well during that period. Unfortunately, he had a very difficult life, suffered from mental health problems, and was persecuted, tortured, attacked, and eventually killed by the police in 1969. His killers were unusual in that they were eventually brought to court, and although they were not convicted of his killing, they were convicted of his assault. And I think that even today, this is perhaps the only time when state agents, we could say, have been brought to court in that manner. And so he's, in recent years, has become more of a commemorated figure. And then lastly, and perhaps tragically, a similar illustration of the difficulties that some Africans still face. This is Sheni Olasheni Lewis, who was the son of the lady on the right of this picture, Aji Taylor, who is a friend of mine, who I went to university with many years ago. And Olasheni was killed by 11 police in 2010 while he was an outpatient in hospital. And Aji and other members of the family have fought for years to try to bring those responsible to book, not ultimately successfully, although they have managed to have a special law enacted, which is known as Shenny's Law, which you could say allows greater scrutiny, surveillance of state agencies when they're dealing with people who are in hospital or suffering from mental health conditions. So that's a rather sad way of ending this history, but anyway, that's how I'm going to end my history, by paying tribute to Aji and many others who have fought in this century and in previous centuries.